Hey guys, tonight we're talking about a drink that reveals something uncomfortable about the human mind. That if something feels meaningful enough, we stop asking where it came from. Because where it came from is a question for people who haven't felt it yet. And when something answers you like that, you hold on to it. After a while, it stops feeling like something you experienced. It feels like something you were meant to understand. Tonight we're tracing how that feeling spread far beyond the jungle, and why so many people come back convinced they were meant to receive it. But before we get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're lying right now, perhaps tucked under a blanket halfway between curiosity and sleep. Now dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. To understand why people fly across the world to sit in a dark room and drink something that makes them sick, you have to start with what it actually feels like. You're sitting on the floor of a wooden room with maybe 12 other people, none of them talking. Someone has lit candles. The air smells like damp wood and something bitter and green that you can't place, like compost mixed with burnt coffee. A man in the centre of the room is pouring a thick, dark liquid from a glass bottle into small ceramic cups. The liquid looks like motor oil. It moves slowly, reluctantly, like it doesn't particularly want to be drunk and is hoping you'll reconsider. He hands you a cup. It's about 2 ounces. It looks like something you'd find at the bottom of a swamp. You drink it. The taste is... there's no kind way to describe it. Imagine boiling tree bark, old shoes, and the concept of regret into a tea, then reducing it until it's thick enough to have an opinion about you. It coats your tongue, it coats your throat. Your stomach receives it like an unwanted guest and immediately begins considering its options. For 20 minutes nothing happens. You sit in the dark. You hear other people breathing. You start to wonder if maybe you got a weak batch. You start composing the text message you'll send your friend tomorrow. I flew to Peru and drank mud and nothing happened. You start feeling a little foolish. Then your stomach decides. The nausea arrives like a wave you didn't see coming. Not a polite hint. A full commitment. You grab for the bucket that someone had the foresight to place next to you. Because everyone gets a bucket which should have told you something. And you purge. Violently. Completely. The kind of throwing up that feels like your body is trying to return something it never agreed to accept. The shamans call this la purga, the cleansing. They say you're not just expelling liquid, you're expelling trauma, negativity, spiritual blockage. You are, they say, emptying yourself so there's room for what comes next. What comes next is that the room starts to move, not the furniture, the room itself. The walls develop a pulse. The candlelight develops trails. The darkness between the flames starts filling with patterns. Not geometric, not exactly. More like vines growing through the air. Organic shapes branching and twisting and layering over your visual field until you're not sure if your eyes are open or closed because both directions contain the same expanding jungle of impossible imagery. The healer begins to sing. An icaro, a melody that doesn't follow any structure your ears recognize but somehow feels like it's always existed, like it was waiting for someone to find it and pass it along. The song moves through the room, moves through you. The patterns in the dark begin to respond to it, shifting and unfolding in time with the melody, as though the sound and the vision are the same thing being expressed in 2 different languages. Your body dissolves, not painfully, just the boundary between you and everything else gets soft, uncertain, debatable. You're still here, you're still aware, but here has expanded to include things it didn't include an hour ago. And then you see them, presences, intelligences, not hallucinations. You've had hallucinations, on bad fevers, on no sleep, and they felt like errors, glitches, images your tired brain generated and forgot to label as fake. This doesn't feel like that. This feels like someone pulled back a curtain that you didn't know was there, and behind it were beings who'd been there the entire time. They might take the form of serpents, jaguars, luminous humanoid figures, geometric intelligences that communicate in colour. The forms vary. The sense of presence doesn't. Something is there. Something is aware of you. And it seems to know things about you that you've never told anyone. Not your therapist, not your best friend, not the version of yourself you talk to in the shower at midnight. Some people weep. Some people laugh. Some people see their dead grandmother sitting in a garden, alive and patient and unimpressed by how long it took them to visit. Some people experience what they can only describe as unconditional love. Some people see the darkest moments of their life replayed with a compassion they've never been able to give themselves. The healer keeps singing. The icaros a thread running through all of it. When the visions get too intense, the song somehow softens them. When they begin to fade, the melody pulls them back. The healer is navigating, and you are a passenger in a boat on a river that flows through every dimension you've ever suspected existed, and several you definitely hadn't. And then something shifts. The visions don't stop, but something moves through them, underneath them, or maybe behind them, like a signal finding its frequency. The presences that were watching you are now addressing you, not in words exactly, in something that arrives already understood. It is about you, specifically you, your life, your path, the thing you've been circling without quite looking at. The version of yourself you've been managing rather than living, the work you keep almost starting, the question you've been too comfortable to ask, and underneath all of that, one thing that is clearer than anything else you've ever felt. You know why you're here. Not here in this room, here, on Earth, in this life, in this particular body with these particular gifts and this particular unfinished business. You know. It arrives not as revelation but as recognition, like remembering something you always knew but had talked yourself out of. The certainty has the weight of something true. It doesn't feel generated by the experience. It feels uncovered by it. You cry, not because it's sad, because it's real, and real things sometimes land that way. This goes on for 4 hours. 4 hours of sustained guided immersion in a reality that operates by rules nobody in your high school ever mentioned. And when it finally begins to recede, slowly, gently, like a tide going out, you're lying on the floor of a wooden room in the dark, surrounded by strangers who've just had something happen to them too. Nobody's talking. You breathe. The wooden ceiling is just a wooden ceiling again. This feels like both a relief and a loss. But underneath the exhaustion, underneath the wrung-out calm, something is humming. A certainty. Low and steady. Not a question. You have something to do. You know what it is. It feels ancient and urgent and personal and yours. And it does not feel like it is only for you. Tomorrow you'll try to explain this to someone who wasn't here. You'll use words like profound and I know how this sounds, and you'll watch their face do the thing faces do when they're trying to be polite about something they don't believe. You won't stop trying. That's the thing nobody warned you about, not the purge, not the visions, not the 4 hours in the dark. The part nobody warned you about is this. You will not be able to stop talking about it. Not because you want to convince anyone, because what you received does not feel like it was meant to be kept. It feels like it was meant to be passed on. And the story of how that feeling came to exist, how a brew made from 2 plants in the Amazon ended up in the chests of millions of people who'd never heard of it before, starts a very long way from here. The Amazon basin contains somewhere in the range of 40,000 species of plants. These plants have been there for millions of years, producing alkaloids, conducting their slow chemical negotiations with insects and fungi and each other, largely indifferent to whether any passing mammal found them interesting. Out of those 40,000 species, 2 particular plants, a vine and a leafy shrub that do not grow together, do not smell alike, do not look alike, and have no obvious reason to be combined, must be prepared together in a precise way to produce the brew. Neither plant works on its own. The shrub contains the compound that the brain responds to. The vine contains the compounds that protect that substance from the body's defences on the way in. Without both, in the right combination, you get either nothing or a very unpleasant afternoon with no visuals and a lot of nausea. With both, one of the most intense psychedelic experiences in the pharmacological catalogue. Here is why this is strange. The compound in the shrub, the one the brain is responding to, is destroyed in the stomach by an enzyme. That enzyme is very efficient. It has been doing this job for millions of years. If you swallow the compound alone, it never reaches the brain. Your gut removes it without ceremony before breakfast. The vine contains substances that switch off that enzyme. Not permanently, just for the duration of the brew's passage through the body. Long enough for the compound from the shrub to survive the journey, reach the bloodstream, cross into the brain. The vine is in effect a key that temporarily disables the body's own lock. For this to be a discovery, someone had to know that the lock existed. Someone had to know that this exact vine would disable it, and someone had to know to combine them. There are 40,000 plants in the Amazon. Nobody knows how they figured it out. Ask a traditionally trained shaman, and they will tell you, without hesitation, that the plants told them. This is not a quirky legend. It is the genuine, serious answer passed down through thousands of years of transmitted knowledge. The vine taught the people who used it. The vine showed them its partner. The vine explained the combination. Western pharmacologists, who spent several decades trying to work out the biochemistry of why the brew works at all, tend to phrase this differently. They use words like empirical trial and generational knowledge accumulation and ethnobotanical transmission. The shamans look at this explanation and say, yes, that is also what we said. The brew has a name that tells you how seriously the people who made it took it. Ayahuasca. From the Quechua language, which does not waste its words. Aya. Spirit. Or the dead, or that which continues after the body stops. Huasca. Vine. Or rope. The thing that connects one place to another. Vine of the soul. Vine of the dead. Rope to the spirits. The name was not chosen lightly. The people who chose it were not describing a recreational experience. They were describing a tool. And this is the part that gets lost in almost every Western account of ayahuasca. And there are now a very large number of Western accounts of ayahuasca. In the communities that developed this practice, it was not medicine in the way that word gets used now. It was not therapy. It was not personal transformation. It was diagnostic, informational, practical. When someone in the community was sick, or when a problem needed solving, or when a decision needed to be made that the ordinary waking mind couldn't manage, the shaman would drink. The shaman, specifically. Not the community, not the seeker, the specialist. He would enter the ceremony with a question. He would navigate the territory with the guidance of particular songs, icaros, that had been passed down intact through generations of teachers, each one designed to do a particular thing in the ceremony space. He would come back with an answer, not a calling, not a mission, not a sense of heightened personal significance. An answer to a specific question, which he would then act on, like a doctor acting on a diagnosis. The vine was a tool, a precise, serious, powerful tool, used carefully by people who had trained for years to use it. The experience produced by the vine in this context, the same visions, the same dissolution, the same sense of contact with something larger, was understood through the framework that the tradition provided. The framework interpreted the visions, The framework contained the experience. The framework gave meaning to whatever was received and placed it in relation to the community and the world. The icaros, those particular songs, were not background music. They were the operating system. Different songs opened different spaces. Different songs called in different presences. The shaman learned them over years, sometimes decades, under the instruction of a teacher who had learned them from his own teacher in a chain that stretched back beyond memory. The songs told the vine where to go. Without the songs, without the lineage behind them, without the framework of what the experience meant and who it was for and what you did with what it gave you, the visions were still real. The dissolution was still real. The sense of receiving something was still real, but there was no container. And what pours into a container that isn't there? Whatever the person brings. Without the framework, the visions are still real. The dissolution is still real. The sense of receiving something is still real. But who interprets it? That question was not asked for a long time, because for a very long time nobody outside the Amazon had any idea this was happening at all. The first outsiders who found out did not react with curiosity. Somewhere in the 1600s, in the jungles of what is now Peru, a Spanish missionary watched a ceremony. He had not been invited. He watched anyway. He saw people drink a dark liquid and spend the next several hours in states he could only describe as possessed, crying, visions, speaking in ways that were not directed at any human in the room. What appeared to be conversations with presences he could not see. He wrote a report. He sent it back to Spain. The report described devil's work, heretical practice, communication with demons. He was not, to be fair, entirely wrong about the phenomenology. Something genuinely outside ordinary consciousness was happening. From where he was standing, with no tradition to read the experience through, what he saw looked exactly like what he said it looked like. The Inquisition opened a file. This is not metaphor. The Spanish Inquisition documented ayahuasca, used in Peru as a religious offense. There are records in the colonial archives, detailed accounts of investigators attempting to suppress a practice that had been running continuously for at least 1,000 years before anyone from Spain had a ship. The Inquisition had an impressive track record of suppressing things. The vine was unmoved. The people who'd been practicing this for thousands of years continued practicing it. They simply stopped doing it where the missionaries could see. Suppression, in the history of psychoactive plants, functions less like a wall and more like a speed bump. The vine went underground. It kept growing, and it found a new set of hands. In the 1930s, in the impoverished northeastern state of Maranhão in Brazil, a rubber tapper named Raimundo Irineu Serra came back from working deep in the Amazon with something he'd encountered through indigenous communities in the jungle. He had drunk the vine. He said he had received a vision. In the vision, he was given a mission. The mission was to create a church. The church would use ayahuasca as its central sacrament. It would combine indigenous ceremony with Christian hymns. Members would wear white. There would be structure, hierarchy, prayer. The vine would be the communion. He called it Santo Daime. The name came from a Portuguese phrase meaning give me love, give me light, give me strength. A prayer embedded in the church's name. A request addressed to the vine. The church grew. Slowly at first through the rubber tapper communities of Amazonia, then into Brazil cities. The União do Vegetal formed in 1961, another syncretic church with the vine at its centre. By the end of the century there were chapters on multiple continents. People in white uniforms singing hymns in Portuguese, receiving the communion of a jungle brew that predated the religion by several thousand years. The vine, which had never needed a church, now had two. The first person to come back from ayahuasca with an instruction to spread it had arrived. He would not be the last. The vine was patient about this. It had been teaching for a very long time, but the world it was about to encounter, the one beyond the Amazon, the one with universities and publishing houses and eventually the internet, was going to do something to the vine's message that the jungle had not prepared for. It was going to scale it. In 1953, a writer landed in the Colombian jungle specifically looking for the vine. His name was William S. Burroughs. He was 40 years old, brilliant, deeply unwell in several directions, and famously difficult to impress. He had heard about a substance the indigenous people called yage, their name for the vine, from researchers who had passed through the region. He had decided he needed it. He needed it enough to travel through several countries with unreliable transport infrastructure. He needed it enough to track down someone willing to prepare it for him. He needed it enough to take it multiple times when the first experience didn't give him what he'd come for. He was looking for what he called a final fix, some substance or experience that would complete something in him, something that couldn't be found in the things he'd already exhausted. He found the vine. The vine disagreed with him profoundly. His letters to Allen Ginsberg from that period are some of the most vivid documents of the early Western encounter with ayahuasca. They describe not revelation, but terror, not insight, but dissolution of a kind he found distressing rather than liberating. The visions were real. The experience was powerful. What Burroughs found in it was not warmth. He took it several more times trying to get a different result. The vine gave him the same one. He wrote up everything he had experienced, packed his notes and went home. Those letters would be published a decade later as the Yage letters. The counterculture would read them and file them under, things to investigate. Somehow, and this is one of the stranger facts in the vine's long history, Burroughs' frightened account made it more appealing, not less. The Yage letters came out in 1963. It was a slim book, a collection of correspondence between William S. Burroughs and Allen Ginsberg. Burroughs writing from Colombia and Peru about a jungle brew he'd tracked down. Ginsberg writing back asking about it. Burroughs describing experiences that were not, by any fair reading, positive. The visions had been intense. The dissolution had been extreme. One letter describes feeling as though his body had been borrowed by something and not returned in quite the right condition. Another describes the sense of something watching him from inside the experience that did not feel friendly. He called it the most shattering experience in his life. This was the sales pitch. The counterculture, already well acquainted with substances that expanded consciousness in various directions, already inclined to interpret intensity as significance, read Burroughs' terrified account and thought, we should do that. It's worth pausing on this for a moment, because it tells you something important about who goes looking for ayahuasca and why. Most drugs make their case through pleasure. They feel good, or they feel exciting, or they feel like relief, and so people seek them again. The case for ayahuasca has never been pleasure. From the first Western account, a man describing the worst experience of his adult life, the appeal has been the extremity itself, not fun, transformative, not comfortable, revelatory. The people who would go looking for this were, from the very beginning, not people seeking escape. They were people seeking something to happen to them. Something real, something that would not be gentle about it. Burroughs, terrified and altered, had given them the exact advertisement they needed. While Burroughs was composing his alarmed letters in Colombia, a Harvard botanist was doing something considerably more methodical. His name was Richard Evans Schultes. He had first gone into the Amazon in the 1940s, and then again, returning each time with specimens, notes, and the quiet conviction that the psychoactive plants of the Western Amazon were among the most significant and least understood pharmacological resources on the planet. Schultes was not a mystic. He was not a seeker. He was a botanist of the old school, methodical, rigorous, and deeply skeptical of people who attach spiritual significance to their data. He documented what the plants were, what the indigenous communities did with them, and what the active compounds appeared to be. He collected everything. He wrote it up precisely. He left the interpretation to other people. He drank ayahuasca in the field, of course. That was the work. He described it as an experience of considerable intensity. He filed the notes and moved on. His students would not be so tidy about it. The mystery Schultes documented but couldn't fully resolve was this. Nobody in Western science could explain why the brew worked. The active compound, the one responsible for the visions, was dimethyltryptamine, known as DMT. This had been identified in the chacruna leaves. The problem was that DMT taken orally is immediately destroyed by an enzyme in the gut. The enzyme has a technical name, monoamine oxidase, but its job is simple. Destroy the active compound before it gets anywhere useful. It does its job efficiently and without complaint. The vine's role, protecting the DMT from the gut long enough to reach the brain, had taken Western scientists decades to figure out. What mattered now was what the mystery meant for the people trying to build on it. For decades, Western pharmacologists knew what was in the plants. They could not account for why ingesting them produced psychedelic effects. The math didn't work. The chemistry didn't work. Something was protecting the DMT from the enzyme, but for years nobody could say what. The answer, when it came, was almost embarrassingly elegant. The vine itself was the key. The vine, Banisteropsis capi is its proper name in case anyone asks, contained compounds that switched off that enzyme in the gut, giving the DMT a clear passage into the bloodstream and from there to the brain. The vine was protecting its partner. Two plants, one problem, one solution. Evolved separately, somehow combined. Western pharmacologists stared at this and wrote careful papers about enzyme inhibition and serotonin receptors. The shamans who had been using this combination for 4,000 years received the news that Western science had finally explained their brew, and reportedly did not find it surprising. His work formed the academic foundation for everything that came after. Schultes catalogued, others theorized, and one figure in particular would take the theory somewhere nobody in the academic world was willing to follow. But before McKenna, there was one more step in the academic chain worth noting. Among the people whose thinking was shaped by Schultes' fieldwork was a young ethnobotanist named Wade Davis. Davis had studied under Schultes and had spent years doing fieldwork among indigenous communities, treating their knowledge systems with the same rigour his mentor had brought to botany. Davis wasn't primarily an ayahuasca researcher, but his approach, treating indigenous knowledge systems as sophisticated repositories of empirical information rather than superstition, set a template that a whole generation of researchers would follow. The core argument, which would be rehearsed endlessly in the literature that followed, was this. If people had been using these plants in highly consistent ways for thousands of years, the consistency itself was data. The shamanic tradition wasn't describing fantasy. It was describing something they had tested, refined, and transmitted with the care of any working pharmacopoeia. The plants, in other words, had been telling people things for a very long time. The question of whether they had been telling people true things, or whether they had been telling people what the people needed to hear, that question was never quite squarely addressed in the academic literature. McKenna addressed it. He addressed it by saying, both. The plants tell you what you need. What you need is true. It was an elegant solution. It was also unprovable in any direction. One of the figures who passed through this world, not a direct product of the academic tradition, but someone who had absorbed its language and its energy, was Terence McKenna. McKenna arrived in the Amazon in the early 1970s. He was 24, already reading voraciously at the intersection of botany, psychology, and the kind of philosophy that academic departments didn't know what to do with. He had taken psychedelics. He had ideas about what they meant. He drank the vine. What happened next was not Burroughs' experience. What happened was, by McKenna's account, which was always vivid and always willing to claim more than the evidence strictly supported, contact. Not uncomfortable contact, not a hostile dissolution, a conversation, with something that seemed to know him, something that spoke in images and symbols and the deep grammar of the universe, something that, when asked, had information. He came back from the Amazon with a theory. The theory was this. The vine was not a drug in the way that word was usually meant. It was a technology, specifically a communications technology. The active compound, he called it the spirit molecule, was produced by the human brain during sleep, during mystical states, possibly at birth and death. The vine amplified it. The vine, in effect, was tuning the radio to a frequency the human brain already had the capability to receive. The entities encountered in the ceremony were real. The information they provided was real. The question was not whether this was happening. The question was what to do with it. McKenna spent the next 2 decades answering that question in public. He was, as a speaker, extraordinary. The voice was deep and unhurried. The vocabulary was vast. He could move from medieval alchemy to quantum physics to Irish folklore to the biochemistry of psilocybin in the space of 4 minutes, and make it feel not scattered but woven. His lectures, recorded on cassette tapes in the 1980s, circulated in the counterculture, later uploaded to the early internet, reached hundreds of thousands of people. The message in all of them was consistent. The plants were teachers, not metaphorically, actually. They had consciousness, intent, and a particular interest in communicating with the humans willing to ingest them. The ayahuasca vine, specifically, was the most forthcoming of these teachers. It would show you things. It would give you things. What things? Whatever you needed, McKenna said. Whatever was most essential. He was careful not to claim that the vine gave everyone the same message. He was careful to say it met you where you were, that the content was yours, that the experience was personal and couldn't be transferred. What he did not say, what perhaps he could not see, being himself inside it, was that the plant gives you exactly what you need, and the plant tells you what you most want to hear, are, from the outside, sometimes indistinguishable. But the most consequential thing McKenna did wasn't the theory, it was the vocabulary. Before McKenna, the available words for talking about ayahuasca in English were drug, hallucinogen, psychedelic, brew, potion. These were the words of pharmacology, of the counterculture, of worried parents. They placed the experience in a category, recreational, chemical, potentially dangerous. McKenna introduced a different set of words: teacher, plant intelligence, archaic, sacred, medicine. He wrote 2 books that became cornerstones of New Age thought, The Archaic Revival and Food of the Gods, both arriving in the early 90s. They positioned the use of psychoactive plants not as fringe behaviour or recreational experimentation, but as the recovery of something ancient that modern civilization had suppressed. The shamans hadn't been doing drugs. They had been practicing a technology. The plants hadn't been producing hallucinations. They had been providing access. The word medicine deserves special attention. McKenna used it early and consistently. It carried everything he needed it to carry. Medicine was legitimate. Medicine was healing. Medicine was something a responsible person sought for good reasons. Medicine had a practitioner, a healer, and a patient, someone suffering. The word did not ask. But what exactly is it healing? The word didn't ask. By what standard do we measure whether it worked? The word simply repositioned the entire enterprise. A drug is something that happens to you. Medicine is something you take intentionally for a purpose, under guidance toward a defined end. The vine became medicine. The shaman became a healer. The ceremony became treatment. And the person sitting in the circle became, implicitly, someone in need of something that only the medicine could provide. But there was a word McKenna never quite used, one that the whole architecture of his argument implied without stating. Not patient, not seeker, not student, prophet. The person who received a revelation from a cosmic intelligence was not simply healed. They were addressed. And if you have been addressed by something that large, the obvious next step, the step that feels not optional but required, is to tell people what you heard. McKenna himself modelled this perfectly. He drank the vine. He received contact. He then spent 2 decades on stages and in recording studios, and at conferences delivering that contact to anyone who would listen. He was not modest about it. He was not uncertain. He was, in the most precise sense of the word, a prophet, a person who received something and felt sent to transmit it. The people who heard him felt it too. That was the mechanism. The vine made prophets, and the prophets made more of them. The people who read McKenna, and there were many of them, came away with a framework that was new in Western culture and very old in Amazonian culture, but also subtly different from either. In Amazonian tradition, the plant was a teacher in the sense that a master craftsman is a teacher. You came with precise questions, you worked under guidance, you applied what you learned in practical ways, and the knowledge was embedded in a community that helped you use it. In McKenna's version, the plant was a teacher in the sense that a prophet was a teacher. It gave you revelation, directly, personally, and the revelation was about you, your path, your purpose, your connection to something larger. The Amazonian version produced curanderos, skilled practitioners of a defined craft. The McKenna version produced prophets, people who came back from the ceremony not just changed, but sent, with something to say, with an audience they needed to find. Not always a mission exactly. More often, a certainty, a clarity, that feeling, the confusion that had plagued them before the ceremony was gone, replaced by a quiet, solid knowing. It felt true. It felt more true than anything they'd felt before. That part was real. Whatever was generating it, the feeling itself was real. There is a detail about how traditional training actually works that matters here, because the contrast with what was about to happen is stark. To become a curandero in a lineage-based tradition, you did not attend a ceremony and receive a calling. You entered a dieta. The word means diet in Spanish, but the practice is more austere than that word suggests. You went into isolation, sometimes deep in the forest, for months, sometimes a year. You ate a severely restricted menu of foods, no salt, no sugar, no meat, no sex, no contact with others beyond your teacher. You drank particular plant preparations under guidance. You fasted. You sat with discomfort in ways that made the discomfort itself into curriculum. The purpose was not transformation as an event. It was transformation as an accumulation. The shaman was not being revealed to himself. He was being built incrementally through sustained practice and supervised exposure in the way that a craftsman is built, through repetition, failure, correction, and the slow accrual of skill. The entities encountered in this training were treated not as messages but as relationships to be managed. The shaman learned which spirits were reliable and which were not. He learned how to ask a useful question. He learned how to distinguish genuine information from the kind of vivid noise that an inexperienced mind in an altered state could mistake for signal. Years, sometimes a decade. This was the training. What the first Western seekers brought back from Peru in the 1980s and 1990s was the ceremony without the dieta, the experience without the formation, the contact with the entities without the years of learning how to calibrate what those entities were actually saying. They had been given the key. They had not been taught what the door opened onto. The first generation of Western ayahuasca travellers came back in the 1980s, and 1990s changed in ways that were hard to argue with. Some were changed in the clinical sense. Depression that had been unresponsive to treatment lifted. Addictions that had survived years of effort released their grip. The grief of trauma, which had resisted ordinary processing, somehow became processable. This was real. Not wishful thinking, not placebo. Something was happening neurologically that produced lasting shifts in mood, behaviour, and personality. The researchers who would later study this in controlled settings would find the same thing. But alongside the genuinely therapeutic cases was another pattern. People came back with missions, not always dramatic missions, not always, "I have been chosen to save humanity," though that happened too. More often it was quieter, a settled certainty that the work they had been avoiding was the work they were meant to do, a clear sense of purpose where there had been confusion, an unambiguous feeling of being pointed somewhere. The mission was rarely modest. The former accountant came back knowing he was supposed to be a healer. The lawyer came back knowing she was meant to run an NGO in Ecuador. The marketing director came back knowing, not believing, knowing, that his real purpose was to guide others through exactly the kind of experience he had just had. They were not delusional. They were not in crisis. They were, by their own accounts, and often by the accounts of people around them, more themselves than they had been in years. They just happened to now have a specific, urgent, deeply felt sense that they had a role to play in something larger. This was, on its face, not a bad thing. People quitting jobs they hated to do work they believed in. People ending relationships that had stopped working. People reordering their priorities toward meaning over comfort. Viewed charitably, this was exactly what a genuinely transformative experience was supposed to produce. Viewed less charitably, it was also exactly what a very powerful psychedelic experience reliably produced in people who had arrived already hoping to be told they were important. The two descriptions were not mutually exclusive. That was the complicated part. Because the vine didn't invent the sense of mission in the people who returned with it. They had arrived already carrying the question, what am I supposed to be doing? The vine in the ceremony, with the ego temporarily dissolved and the narrating mind temporarily offline, reached into that question and answered it from the deepest layer available, the person's own most charged desires, the ones that never quite made it into daylight conversation. The answer felt like revelation, because it arrived from below the level where the ordinary self kept its doubts. It went around the part of the mind that said, "But are you sure? That's ambitious. What makes you think you're the one?" In the ceremony, that part was quiet. In the ceremony, only the certainty spoke. The integration circles of the 1990s were places where these people found each other. Small groups, often meeting in living rooms or rented studios. People who'd been to Peru or to ceremonies in the Netherlands, where the brew sat in a legal grey area, or to urban ceremonies run by one of the growing number of Westerners who had trained with indigenous communities and brought the practice back with them. They shared their experiences. They processed what they'd been shown. They held the revelations up in the light and tried to understand what to do with them. The conversations had a particular texture. There was warmth. There was the specific intimacy of people who had gone through something together that was hard to explain to anyone who hadn't. There was genuine support, and there was, quietly present throughout, a shared assumption that what the vine had shown each of them was true, that the missions were real, that the callings were pointing somewhere worth following. Nobody in the room was positioned to say, "What if the plant just tells you what you need to hear?" Because the plant had told all of them what they needed to hear. And here is where something structurally interesting began to happen. A significant number of the people in those circles had come back from their ceremony with the same calling, or rather, different callings that pointed in the same direction. The former software developer believed his purpose was to facilitate ceremonies for others. The therapist believed her gift was now the integration work, helping people process exactly what she had processed. The teacher believed he was meant to train facilitators. The vine, it turned out, had a strong preference for recommending careers in the vine industry. This is not a cynical observation. The people involved were sincere. They genuinely believed in the value of what they had experienced and wanted to bring it to others. The calling felt completely authentic because it was built entirely from authentic materials. Their real longing to help, their real experience of transformation, their real desire for meaning. The calling was real. It had just been assembled by a process that reliably assembled the same calling from whatever raw materials were available. Every teacher produces students who become teachers. The vine was an excellent teacher, but what it was really producing wasn't students, it was apostles, people who had received something and could not rest until they had passed it on. The vine didn't just change the people who drank it, it deployed them. By the late 1990s, the geography of the ayahuasca world was shifting. The first shift was in Europe. The Netherlands, operating under a legal framework that drew careful distinctions between the DMT compound itself, illegal, and the botanical brew containing it, in a grey area, had become a quiet hub for Western ceremonies. Small groups met in Amsterdam and Utrecht. Dutch practitioners who had trained in Peru returned and offered sessions. Word circulated in networks that were earnest, discreet, and very much not yet the internet. It was also, for the first time, accessible without a transatlantic flight. Someone in London or Berlin or Paris could drive to it, could go on a long weekend and come back Monday with whatever the vine had decided to tell them. The ceremonies in Europe were almost always smaller than the Peruvian originals, less elaborate, often without the full icaros tradition, replaced by Western music or silence or whatever the facilitator had developed through their own practice. The setting was different: a rented community room, a farmhouse, a therapist studio, and the setting changed things in ways that were difficult to articulate but that experienced practitioners could feel immediately. The jungle ceremony and the European ceremony were using the same plants. They were not quite the same experience. But for most of the people attending, the comparison was unavailable to them. They had nothing to compare it to. The Peruvian city of Iquitos, a jungle city in the middle of the Amazon, accessible only by plane or river boat, humid as a greenhouse, loud as something permanently celebrating, had been working with Western seekers for years. Individual curanderos had taken on foreign clients. Small, informal retreat spaces had opened. Word spread in the way that word spread before the internet. Slowly, reliably, person by person. Someone came back from Iquitos different. Someone asked what happened. Someone wrote down the name of the curandero. Richard Evans Schultes had spent 60 years documenting the plants of the Amazon with the careful disinterest of a scientist who let the data speak. By the time the internet arrived, he was gone. He never saw what was about to happen to the vine he had catalogued. Terence McKenna was gone by then too, taken by a brain tumour in his early 50s. In his final interview, asked about death, he said the universe was under no obligation to make sense to him. He sounded calm. The tape recordings of his lectures were already circulating on the nascent internet by then. They would never stop circulating. The ideas he had spent 2 decades developing, the plant as teacher, the DMT as cosmic signal, the ceremony as the most important technology humans had forgotten, These were already alive independently of him. The internet arrived, and the slow, careful word of mouth that had governed the ayahuasca world for 2 decades became, almost overnight, a very different kind of conversation. Forums appeared, trip reports accumulated, Reddit threads, YouTube videos of ceremonies, podcast episodes, blogs from people who had been to Iquitos and come back certain. The question, have you tried ayahuasca, moved from jungle circles and New Age bookshops to the kind of dinner party where it sat comfortably between discussions of microdosing and the ketogenic diet. More importantly, the cost of going came down. Not the price of the retreat. That was about to go up considerably. The cost of information. The cost of finding the place, identifying the shaman, knowing what to expect. All of that was now searchable. All of that was now reviewable. All of that was now in the hands of anyone with a laptop and a credit card and a long weekend of existential unease. The vine, which had been the exclusive knowledge of an Amazonian specialist class for 4,000 years, and then the exclusive experience of countercultural seekers for 40, was about to go mass market. And in Iquitos, they were already building the infrastructure. Iquitos had always been a city that made its living from the jungle. It started with rubber. In the late 1800s, Iquitos was a boom town. The rubber trade turned a remote river settlement into one of the wealthiest cities in South America, which is the kind of sentence that sounds like progress until you find out what the rubber trade cost the people who actually collected it. The rubber barons built ornate mansions. The ironwork was shipped from Europe. Then the rubber market collapsed, and Iquitos was left with grand architecture and no industry, which is a condition the city has adapted to with a particular kind of practical ingenuity ever since. By the 1990s, the new economy was spiritual tourism. The city had something no other city on earth had in such concentration: a dense network of traditionally trained curanderos, indigenous knowledge about the vine that stretched back generations, and a remote location that filtered out the casually curious. You had to want to get there. Getting there required effort. That effort functioned as a kind of selection. The people who made it to Iquitos in the early years were committed. They had done the research. They had read the books. They had in most cases already tried other things. They were not looking for a holiday. The curanderos who worked with them treated them accordingly. The early relationship between Western seekers and traditional practitioners in Iquitos was, by most accounts, genuinely productive. The curanderos had deep knowledge they were willing to share within limits. The seekers had resources and an earnest desire to learn. The ceremonies were conducted with care. The traditional icaros were sung. The work was real. There were misunderstandings. The Western framework and the Shipibo framework, the dominant indigenous tradition in the Iquitos region, operated on different assumptions about what the vine was and what it could do. Western seekers often arrived expecting psychotherapy. The Shipibo tradition was not psychotherapy. It was something older and stranger than that, with its own logic and its own endpoints. But the encounters were, in the main, handled with mutual respect. Then the numbers changed. Between 2005 and 2015, the number of retreat centers in the Iquitos region went from a handful to somewhere between 100 and 200. Let that sink in for a moment. 100 to 200, in a city accessible only by boat or plane, in the middle of the Amazon, for a ceremony that, within living memory, had been practiced by specialists with decades of training. The demand had not grown linearly. It had grown the way things grow when the internet gets involved, which is to say, it had grown exponentially, and the infrastructure had sprinted to catch up with it, in the way that infrastructure always does when there is money on the table. Some of the new centres were excellent, run by trained practitioners with proper medical, screening, genuine integration support, and the kind of care for the plant and the tradition that the Shipibo communities recognised as legitimate. some were not. The economics were straightforward, and once you saw the structure, difficult to look away from. A trained curandero who had spent 10 or 15 years learning the tradition could now charge Western visitors $1,500 to $4,000 for a week-long retreat. Before the tourism wave, the same curandero had charged modest local fees for the community work that was the traditional purpose of his practice. This was not inherently corrupting. The income was real. The families of practitioners benefited. Some of the money flowed back into indigenous communities in ways that supported the traditions themselves. But it also changed the incentives. When the demand outgrew the supply of trained practitioners, which it did quickly, the market found its own solution. It always does. Weekend shaman certification. Courses appeared. This is not satire. This is a documented fact. You could, in the Iquitos region, and later in retreat destinations around the world, complete a training program of several days to several weeks, receive a certificate, in some cases a laminated certificate, and begin advertising yourself as a guide for ayahuasca ceremonies. The traditional training, recall, involved years of isolation, dietary restriction, and supervised work under a master who had himself undergone years of it. The traditional training was not a weekend. The laminated certificate was a weekend. The people attending these accelerated ceremonies often didn't know the difference. Why would they? They had read about the vine online. They had watched ceremony footage on YouTube. They had followed retreat centers on social media where every post was a testimonial, and every testimonial described healing, clarity, and revelation. The language of the reviews was consistent and luminous. What the reviews rarely mentioned was the training, or lack of it, of the person running the ceremony. A TripAdvisor profile is not a lineage. The genuine practitioners, the ones who had done the dieta, who had trained for years, who carried the actual knowledge, watched this with feelings that range from pragmatic acceptance to something considerably less peaceful. The Shipibo communities of the Ucayali region became increasingly vocal about what was happening to a practice they had developed and protected for generations. Their concern was not that Westerners were using the vine. Some collaboration had been happening for decades. Their concern was that Westerners were drinking it outside any tradition, interpreting it outside any framework, and then going home to build businesses around it. The vine was being franchised, without the franchise owner's permission. The Silicon Valley contingent arrived around 2010 and brought their own particular flavour to the proceedings. They were, as a cohort, easy to identify. They arrived in business class. They wore expensive performance outdoor clothing in the jungle, which is not a criticism, but is a detail. They had assistants who had booked the retreat. They described the experience they were seeking in terms of optimization and insight extraction, which is the language of a field where everything, including consciousness, is a problem to be solved. They also arrived with a prior conviction that they were doing important work. The tech industry has its own mythology of the chosen, the disruptors, the builders, the people who are going to change how the world works. This is not a small mythology. It is foundational to the culture, reinforced at every level from startup pitch decks to TED Talks to the hagiographic biographies of the people who built the platforms everyone uses. These were people who already believed, at some level, that they mattered enormously. They drank the vine agreed, and then, this is the part the productivity pitch left out, they came home and started telling everyone. The tech industry had found its new profit-making technology. Not a metaphor, the literal mechanism. You went in, you received something, you came back unable to stop transmitting it. Podcast appearances, blog posts, dinner party recommendations, quiet suggestions to other founders that they should really consider going to Peru. The vine didn't just validate them, it deployed them. By this point, the writer Tim Ferriss had publicly recommended ayahuasca. in terms that spoke directly to the optimization-minded seeker. A few days in the jungle was, he suggested, the equivalent of years of psychotherapy. This was not a clinical claim. It was a productivity pitch. It was exactly the framing that a certain kind of technology worker understood. High investment, high return, transformative outcome. The concept of hacking, applied by this culture to everything from sleep to diet to mortality itself, had found its most ambitious target. Consciousness, the operating system of the self, the factory settings of whatever you were. Multiple tech founders emerged from Peruvian retreats and attributed company founding decisions, product pivots, and leadership revelations directly to the vine. This was discussed openly on podcasts, in magazine profiles, in the kind of business press that normally covered disruption and now found itself covering dissolution. Paul Simon had gone to Peru. Sting had gone. Will Smith discussed his experience. Each account touched the same notes: difficulty, surrender, revelation, clarity. Each account added one more data point to the cultural record that said, this is something serious people do. The vine, which had once been documented by the Spanish Inquisition as evidence of heresy, was now appearing in Forbes. The people arriving at the retreats were not, by the mid-2000s, primarily the countercultural seekers of earlier decades. They were a different demographic, and the research surveys being done on Western ayahuasca users painted a consistent portrait. Educated, higher income than average, disproportionately likely to have already tried therapy, meditation, and yoga, and arriving very often at what researchers called a transition point, a career shift, the end of a relationship, a midlife reckoning of some kind. There was a specific pattern in how they had arrived at ayahuasca. They had done the other things first. Therapy hadn't fully resolved it. Meditation had helped, but hadn't reached the thing underneath. Yoga had become a practice rather than a turning point. And somewhere in the accumulated literature of self-improvement, the word ayahuasca had appeared with increasing frequency, described in terms that made it sound like the next level. The graduation phenomenon, researchers called it. Ayahuasca positioned not as a first resort, but as the final frontier of the inner work stack. This framing made the price point easier. $1,500 to $4,000 for a week in Peru was a lot, but not, the logic went, compared to years of therapy that had only gotten you partway there, not compared to what it would cost to stay stuck. The luxury end of the market leaned into this directly. Retreat centers like Rhythmia in Costa Rica and Blue Morpho in Peru charged $3,000 to $7,000 per week and offered their services not in the language of psychedelics, but in the language of high-end wellness, integration, healing, transformation, breathwork, and sound therapy included. The branding was impeccable. The TripAdvisor reviews were luminous. The certification of the shamans was in many cases not something anyone had thought to verify. What happened in those ceremonies was not, from the outside, distinguishable from what happened to anyone else. The visions were real. The dissolution was real. The purge was, if anything, somewhat leveling. Everyone ends up in approximately the same position over a bucket. But the content of the downloads was revealing. The former accountant had come back knowing he was supposed to be a healer. The tech entrepreneur came back knowing he was supposed to scale his company differently, or leave his company entirely and build something that would touch more lives. Or the work he was already doing was, in fact, the mission, just with greater urgency and a sense of cosmic sanction he had previously lacked. The vine, working with the materials it was given, produced what the material suggested. Someone who arrived believing they were building the future came back with confirmation that they were building the future. Someone who arrived unsure whether their career was meaningful came back with clarity that it was, or clarity that it wasn't, but either way, came back with clarity. The clarity was consistent. The direction it pointed varied. But the form was always the same. Before, confusion. After, knowing. What the vine had done, in most cases, was resolve ambivalence in favour of whatever the person most deeply wanted to believe. This is not nothing. Resolved ambivalence has real value. People who act with conviction tend to do things. The problem was not the resolution itself. It was the unexamined confidence that the resolution had come from outside the person rather than from inside them, that they had been told something true rather than shown their own most pressed belief. The deaths began in the mid-2000s, not many relative to the number of ceremonies taking place, but enough to break through the silence that surrounded the industry's less luminous stories. The silence had been sustained by several forces. The community around ayahuasca had strong norms of discretion, partly because the substance was illegal in most countries, partly because the culture of the vine rewarded positive framing and made negative reports feel somehow like failures of integration rather than evidence of systemic problems. If your ceremony was difficult, you were encouraged to sit with it. If something went wrong, you were encouraged to consider what it might be showing you. This is not a culture optimized for reporting harm. The pattern was almost always the same. A retreat center with inadequate medical screening, a participant who had not disclosed, or had not been asked about, a pre-existing condition or medication, and then a ceremony in which something went wrong in a way that the facilitator was not trained to manage. Serotonin syndrome is a medical condition that occurs when too much serotonin accumulates in the body. Ayahuasca's active compounds affect serotonin pathways. Certain antidepressants, specifically a class called SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which many of the Westerners seeking the vine were taking for the depression and anxiety they hoped the vine would help, also affect serotonin pathways. Combine them in the wrong proportions and the result is a medical emergency that can escalate quickly. This was not a secret. The interaction was documented in the pharmacological literature. The medical screening question was simple. Are you taking any antidepressants? Some retreat centers asked it. Some did not. Kyle Nolan was 18 years old when he died at a retreat in Peru. His body was buried on the property by the shaman who ran the ceremony, apparently to avoid reporting the death. He was found later. The shaman was convicted. 18. Matthew Dawson Clark died at a retreat in Peru in 2016. His death was widely reported. His family spoke publicly. The questions they asked, about screening, about qualifications, about who was responsible when something went catastrophically wrong in a legal grey zone, didn't receive clear answers because there was no institution with jurisdiction that was required to provide them. There were others. A pattern emerged in the press coverage when the press started paying attention. A name, an age, a retreat centre, a country that had no regulatory framework for the industry operating inside it, and a family left trying to understand what had happened and why. The industry responded where it responded at all, with calls for self-regulation, voluntary guidelines, community standards, conversations about best practices, the kind of response that industries produce when they are aware that external regulation is coming and are attempting to stay ahead of it. External regulation, in most jurisdictions, did not come. The substance was illegal. Regulating an illegal industry is a conceptual puzzle that most governments declined to solve. So the deaths continued, at a low rate, in a sector with no oversight serving a growing global demand. There were sexual assault cases too. The vulnerability of a person in an ayahuasca ceremony is extreme. The ego is dissolved. The ordinary capacity for judgment and self-protection is offline. The trust placed in the ceremony guide is total, because at that point in the experience, trust is not a choice the rational mind is making. It is simply the state the person is in. Some facilitators, in centers around the world, exploited this. The pattern was documented across multiple retreat sites over multiple years. Participants reporting assault during or after ceremonies, facilitated by exactly the combination of physical isolation, profound altered state, and the authority that the shaman role conferred. The industry had no regulatory body, no licensing board, no mandatory reporting, no mechanism for a victim to report an assault to any authority that had jurisdiction over the retreat centre. The jungle, it turned out, was not a place that policed itself. The people who built and ran the legitimate operations watched all of this, and felt something between anguish and helplessness. The anguish was genuine. They had come to the vine with real intentions and real devotion. They ran their centres with care. They screened their participants. They had trained practitioners, proper follow-up, integration support. But they operated in the same industry as the laminated certificate shamans, and from the outside it was not always easy to tell which was which. The TripAdvisor ecosystem did not distinguish between a ceremony run by a 40-year Shipibo lineage holder and one run by someone who had attended 3 retreats and decided their experience qualified them to guide others. Both had 5-star reviews. Both described themselves as healers. Both attracted people who arrived with the same sincere desire for transformation, and both sent those people home with an identical sense, almost invariably, of having been shown something important. That was perhaps the strangest part of all of it. Even the bad ceremonies produced profits. Online, the testimonial culture had reached a scale that nobody had anticipated. The r/Ayahuasca subreddit had accumulated over 200,000 members by the mid-2000s. The dominant mode was the trip report, long, detailed personal accounts of ceremonies organised around the before, during, after structure that had come to define how the experience was narrated in Western culture. What was I like before? What I experienced? What I understand now? The What I Understand Now sections were the most read. They were also the most consistent, regardless of the details of the ceremony, the location, the facilitator, the person's background or reasons for going. The understanding arrived in a recognizable form, clarity about purpose, release of something that had been held too long, a sense of connection to something larger, and frequently a mission. The comment sections were warm and affirming. The community had strong norms of support and almost no norms of skepticism. A trip report that ended with, "The vine showed me I need to leave my job and become a healer," received encouragement, not questions. A smaller counter-narrative was developing on the same platforms, but it had far less reach. These were the accounts from people whose ceremonies had not resolved into clarity. People who had returned with missions that had, over the following months, turned out to be confusing or destructive. People who had experienced re-traumatization, the vine opening something they weren't equipped to process, with no integration support on the other side, people describing years of integration that had gone nowhere, or had circled back to more ceremonies, which had produced more material, which required more integration. These posts got fewer upvotes. They disrupted the narrative. They were real, and they accumulated, but they accumulated quietly, in threads titled, "Not the Experience I Expected," or "Struggling with My Integration," rather than in the front-page glow of the transformation story. The Vine had an excellent reputation, partly because it earned it, partly because the culture around it was very good at amplifying the success stories and absorbing the failures quietly into the category of integration challenges. The mainstream was watching all of this and making its own decisions about what to believe. By 2018, ayahuasca was no longer something you heard about in counterculture circles or wellness retreats. It was in the New York Times. It was on podcasts with tens of millions of listeners. Celebrities discussed their ceremonies with the ease of people describing a spa weekend. The conversation had moved from "Have you heard about this?" to "Yes, I've been thinking about going." the psychedelic research community, which had been publishing cautiously hopeful studies about psilocybin and depression, about MDMA and PTSD, about the cluster of compounds that all worked on the same serotonin receptors as ayahuasca, had built enough scientific credibility that the cultural conversation had shifted. These weren't fringe substances anymore. They were increasingly the subject of research programs at Johns Hopkins and NYU and Imperial College London. They appeared in mainstream medical journals. They were being discussed in Congress. None of this was specifically about ayahuasca. The research was mostly about psilocybin in controlled clinical settings, with careful screening and professional support and follow-up therapy. The clinical trial context and the icaros retreat context were vastly different enterprises sharing a pharmacological relative. But the cultural effect was indiscriminate. If psilocybin worked for depression, then psychedelics worked. And if psychedelics worked, then the people who had been doing ayahuasca in the jungle for years, and coming back transformed, had been right all along. The validation had arrived, just slightly adjacent to the thing being validated. And this is where the story takes a turn that the Vine's original practitioners could not have anticipated. The first generation of Western seekers had come back from their ceremonies with missions. Many of those missions pointed toward the Vine. They became facilitators, integration coaches, ceremony guides. They set up retreat centers. They trained under whatever practitioners they could access. Some of that training was genuine, some was not. But regardless of the quality of the training, they ran ceremonies, and the people who attended those ceremonies came back with callings. And a meaningful proportion of those callings pointed again toward the Vine. The second generation of plant medicine facilitators was now operating across Europe and North America, not in the jungle, in rented farmhouses in Vermont, in therapy studios in Berlin, in someone's converted barn in Oxfordshire. The plants were the same, the brew was the same, the setting was not. What was also the same, every ceremony produced prophets, people who came back from the experience with something they needed to pass on. And a meaningful number of them passed it on by running ceremonies of their own. The Vine had built a distributed prophecy network, entirely by accident, entirely through the reliable human response to receiving a revelation, the compulsion to share it. What the setting did was remove the last remaining container. In Iquitos, even at a mediocre retreat center, you were in the jungle. The sounds were real jungle sounds. The heat was real jungle heat. The remoteness was real remoteness. The sense of being somewhere that preceded you and would outlast you, that was real, even if the certificate on the wall was laminated. In a converted barn in Oxfordshire, there was no jungle. There was only the brew and the guide, and 10 people lying on yoga mats, and whatever the guide had assembled from the YouTube videos and the weekend trainings and the one ceremony in Peru that they had been told, enough. The calling produced by these ceremonies was no less vivid, no less certain, no less pointed at the person's deepest desire to matter in some specific and urgent way. The economics of the second-generation facilitator were also worth examining. A single ceremony in someone's home or rented space charged between $200 and $600 per person. 10 participants, $2,000 to $6,000 for one evening's work, in a city, with no flights required. The training had cost in many cases a few $1,000s for a weekend course or a week-long retreat. The return on investment, and the people running these calculations often came from industries that ran such calculations, was evident. This was not the primary motivation. For most of the facilitators in this space, it was not even a conscious consideration. They genuinely believed they were helping. They had experienced something real, and they wanted to pass it on. The financial viability of the work was, in their framing, simply what allowed them to do it. But the incentive structure was what it was. The Vine rewarded the people who spread the Vine. It gave them a calling, and the calling was to facilitate, and the facilitation paid reasonably well, and the people they facilitated came back with callings, and some of those callings were also to facilitate. The vine had become, accidentally and through completely human mechanisms, a multi-level structure in which the product being sold was transformation, and the salespeople were themselves the product's most enthusiastic customers. Nobody had designed this. It had simply grown, the way certain things grow when conditions are favourable, quickly and without anyone noticing until it was large. The people who had been doing this the longest, the genuine practitioners, the ones with real training, the Shipibo healers who had navigated the tourism economy with their tradition more or less intact, had noticed. They had in fact been saying something for a while. The Shipibo-Konibo people of the Ucayali River Basin were the tradition most directly affected by the tourism wave. Their healers, the ones with genuine lineage, with actual training, with the icaros that had been learned and refined over generations, had been the original draw. The Western seekers had come to Iquitos partly because the Shipibo tradition was considered the most intact, the most authentic, the most connected to what the vine had been before the weekend certification courses arrived. The Shipibo communities watched as their practice was replicated, approximated, and exported without them. Their objection was not that outsiders were using the vine. Some collaboration had been ongoing for decades and was, in the right conditions, genuinely valuable. Their objection was more precise than that. The vine, used outside a tradition, produced experiences without a container. The experiences were real, the visions were real, the sense of contact was real. But without a tradition to interpret them, without the framework that told you what you were seeing and what it meant and what you were supposed to do with it, the experiences defaulted to the only interpretive framework available, the one the person had brought in with them. And the framework most Western seekers brought in with them was built from the same materials, a culture that told people they were special, that their suffering was meaningful, that their transformation was imminent, and that the right experience properly undergone would reveal their purpose. The vine did not create that framework, it operated within it, and within that framework it was extremely effective at producing exactly the kind of certainty the framework promised. What the Shipibo healers were describing, in the language of tradition, was something that integration therapists were independently arriving at from the other direction. The integration therapists, the therapists who had built practices specifically around helping people process psychedelic experiences, had been seeing a pattern in their clients for years. People came to integration therapy with the contents of their ceremony, the visions, the revelations, the specific instructions they believed they had received, and a meaningful subset of them were not processing a genuine transformation. They were processing a very intense endorsement of their existing worldview, delivered with the force and certainty of a revelation. The therapists had a name for it, spiritual bypassing. The term had been coined before ayahuasca became mainstream. It described the use of spiritual practice to sidestep psychological work rather than deepen it, to feel enlightened rather than to do the harder thing of being changed. The ceremony as an event that produced the feeling of resolution without the actual resolution. The vine was extraordinarily good at producing that feeling, which meant it was also, used without adequate support, occasionally extraordinarily good at producing very confident people making very large decisions on the basis of what they had been shown in a 5-hour ceremony in a rented barn. And then, in 2006, something had already happened in American courts that most people hadn't noticed at the time, but that was about to become very relevant. A Brazilian church had won a unanimous ruling from the United States Supreme Court, and the vine had, for the first time, a legal foothold in the United States of America. In 2006, the United States Supreme Court ruled 9-0 in favor of a Brazilian church. The church was the União do Vegetal. The case was called Gonzalez versus O Centro Espírita beneficente union du vegetal. The government had argued that the Controlled Substances Act left no room for religious exemptions to the ban on DMT, regardless of how the DMT was being used. The court disagreed, unanimously. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act required the government to demonstrate a compelling interest in banning the substance even in a religious context. The government could not make that case. The Union du Vegetal won the right to use ayahuasca as a sacrament on American soil. The ruling was narrow. It applied specifically to that church, not to ayahuasca use generally. But it was also the first time in American legal history that a court had looked at this brew and said, not always illegal, context matters. The vine had survived the Inquisition, it had survived Burroughs. It had survived being classified as a Schedule I substance, the most restricted category, reserved for drugs with no medical use and high potential for abuse, in countries around the world. Now, it had a 9-0 decision from the highest court in the United States. The decision didn't change the daily reality of ayahuasca use in America by much. The Union du Vegetal had a relatively small American membership. Other churches and individual practitioners had no immediate protection. Ceremonies outside religious context remained illegal in all 50 states. But symbolically it was significant. The government had argued for complete prohibition. The court had said, your argument isn't strong enough. For a substance that had spent 4 decades in the most stigmatized legal category available, this was not nothing. And the legal reformers noticed. A small, tenacious cohort of lawyers and advocates had been working for years at the intersection of religious freedom and drug policy. They studied the ruling. They looked at the structure of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. They began advising other groups, other syncretic churches, other spiritual communities built around plant medicine, on how to construct their own cases. The vine, slowly, carefully, one legal argument at a time, was finding its way through the wall. The churches that followed in the Union du Vegetal's wake were a varied group. Some were genuine syncretic traditions, communities that had grown organically out of Santo Daime and UDV lineages, with real liturgy, real membership, real ceremonial structure inherited from the Brazilian originals. These communities had existed quietly for years before the Supreme Court ruling gave them a more defensible legal position. Some were newer, looser, harder to categorize. Spiritual communities built around the vine, structured as churches because the church structure offered the best available legal protection, with varying degrees of theological seriousness and varying degrees of actual training among their facilitators. And some were, by any honest accounting, entrepreneurs who had noticed that church was a useful word. The legal landscape that opened up after 2006 was not a free pass. Courts continued to scrutinize religious sincerity claims. The government continued to challenge new applicants. Individual practitioners with no church affiliation had no protection whatsoever. But the wall had a door in it now. That changed things. It changed who applied. It changed who incorporated. It changed the conversations happening in integration circles and on online forums where threads about legal structures proliferated alongside trip reports and integration advice. The vine, 400 years after the Spanish Inquisition had tried to put it in a file, was now being processed by American lawyers. Both institutions remained optimistic about the outcome. Meanwhile, the science was catching up, the psychedelic research renaissance, dormant since the early 1970s when the political climate had shut down academic research on compounds like LSD and psilocybin, had been restarting quietly since the mid-1990s. The key institution was Johns Hopkins, where researchers had begun studying psilocybin in the early 2000s with the methodological rigor that had been missing from earlier, more freewheeling research. A 2006 paper from Johns Hopkins reported that psilocybin, administered in a controlled setting, produced mystical experiences that participants described as among the most meaningful of their lives. The effects on well-being were measurable and lasting. This was peer-reviewed. This was published in a major journal. This was not a counterculture pamphlet. The implications were enormous, and they landed slowly, the way implications tend to land in science, through replication, through follow-up studies, through the accumulation of evidence that eventually becomes impossible to dismiss. By 2020, psilocybin-assisted therapy had earned enough regulatory attention in the United States to suggest that mainstream medical acceptance was not a matter of if, but when. The research was about psilocybin. The cultural spillover was onto everything that worked through the same receptors, including the vine. The integration therapy field had been growing in parallel, and by the late 2000s it had developed enough critical mass to begin producing its own literature, not about the experiences themselves, but about what happened to people in the months and years afterward. What the integration therapists were seeing was a distribution. At one end, people who had undergone genuine, lasting therapeutic change, depression that had lifted and stayed lifted, trauma that had become processable in ways it hadn't been before, addictions that had released their grip. These cases were real. They were not rare. The therapists were careful to say this. They were not, most of them, skeptics. They had often come to this work through their own experiences with the vine. They had seen too many real outcomes to dismiss the whole enterprise. What they were trying to articulate was something more precise. The outcomes were real, but they were not evenly distributed, and the distribution was not random. The people who did well tended to share certain characteristics. They had come with a specific intention, not change my life in general, but something more targeted. They had good support afterward. They had a therapist or integration circle that could help them work through what had come up. They had the psychological stability to hold intense material without fragmenting. They had not arrived at the ceremony in crisis. The people who struggled tended to share different characteristics. They had come seeking something that the vine, or anything else, was not equipped to provide. An answer to a question that was not answerable by revelation. They arrived in crisis, or with undiagnosed conditions that made the dissolution terrifying rather than freeing. They had no support afterward, or, and this was the pattern that appeared most often in the integration therapist case files, they had arrived with a very strong prior belief about who they were and what they were for, and the ceremony had confirmed it, loudly, and they had come back and acted on it with a conviction that felt like certainty, but functioned like impulsivity. At the other end, something more complicated. People who'd returned from their ceremonies with enormous certainty that had, over time, not resolved into anything useful. People who had quit jobs, ended relationships, relocated, or given away significant amounts of money on the basis of what the vine had shown them, and who were, a year or two later, sitting in a therapist's office, trying to understand what had happened. The certainty had been real. The vision had been vivid and compelling. The sense of mission had felt exactly like what you would expect genuine revelation to feel like, but the mission itself had turned out to be either unworkable, destructive to the person's actual life, or simply not what the person had thought it was when they were lying on a mat at 3 a.m. in a jungle ceremony with their ego dissolved. The surveys that researchers had been doing on Western ayahuasca users produced a portrait that was, once assembled, surprisingly consistent. The people going to retreats were disproportionately educated and higher income. They had, in most cases, already tried multiple other approaches: therapy, medication, meditation, yoga. They arrived with specific motivations, and those motivations clustered around a recognizable set of problems: treatment-resistant depression, anxiety that had not responded to conventional treatment, PTSD, especially the kind that had resisted ordinary processing, addiction, and the one that appeared most often but was most rarely stated directly, the sense that something essential was missing from life. The clinical research supported the vine for some of these, not all of them. For treatment-resistant depression, the evidence was genuinely promising. For PTSD, early data was cautiously encouraging. For addiction, particularly to opioids and alcohol, some small studies showed real effects, though the mechanism was poorly understood and the durability of the outcomes depended heavily on what happened afterward. For something essential is missing from life, the vine was extraordinarily effective at producing a feeling of essential things being found. Whether the things found were actually missing, or whether the experience of finding them was itself the thing, that question was harder to answer with a study design. The addiction treatment angle deserved particular attention because it was the one the wellness industry leaned on hardest. Ayahuasca for addiction was a compelling narrative. The vine burns away the pattern that the substance was filling. Several high-profile accounts of people achieving lasting sobriety after a ceremony had added real weight to the claim. What the careful researchers noted was that these outcomes depended almost entirely on the integration work that followed. The ceremony alone did not change the behavior. The ceremony opened a window. Whether the window was used well depended on what happened in the days, weeks, and months afterward. And the retreat industry, which ended on Sunday and sent you home Monday, was not the place that happened. The integration therapists coined a phrase for this particular pattern, the ayahuasca inflation. Not clinical inflation in the psychiatric sense, not diagnosable grandiosity or mania, though in predisposed individuals those outcomes were also documented. The ayahuasca inflation was subtler, a persistent upward revision of the person's sense of their own importance, their mission, and their place in whatever was unfolding. It was, in theological terms, the false prophet problem. The prophet receives a revelation. The revelation is real. Something genuine happened in the ceremony. The question is not whether the experience was authentic. The question is whether the person is qualified to interpret what it means and act as its messenger. In the tradition, that question had an answer. The shaman qualified the prophet. Years of training, supervision, and community accountability determined whether what you received was worth transmitting, and how. In the modern Western retreat, there was no qualification process. You drank, you received, you returned. Whether what you brought back deserved to be delivered to others at volume, that was entirely up to you. And people, as a general rule, tend to believe that it does. The person had, before the ceremony, a normal relationship with self-importance. They were sometimes important, sometimes not. They mattered to some people and less to others. Their work had value and also limitations. After the ceremony, that calibration shifted. The work was now essential. The mission was now urgent. The person's particular path was now cosmically endorsed, not in a delusional way, not in a way that a psychiatric assessment would flag, but in a way that quietly permeated every subsequent decision. The vine had not lied. It had shown each person what they most needed to see, which was their own most charged, most urgent, most deeply held sense of what they were for. Then it had delivered that vision with the full force of one of the most powerful psychedelic experiences available to the human nervous system. The calibration issue was not that the vision was false. The issue was that it had arrived without the context that would have told the person how much weight to give it. The patterns that integration therapists documented looked from the outside unremarkable. People making life changes, people pursuing meaning, people taking the vine's instructions seriously. The texture of the changes was telling. The executive who quit a high-paying job to become a plant medicine facilitator, and who 2 years later was facilitating ceremonies for which she had no real training, charging significant fees and experiencing mounting debt, had not done something obviously irrational. She had followed a vision that felt completely real. The problem was not that she had trusted the vision. The problem was that the vision had told her something about her destiny, without telling her anything about her capability, her resources, or the reality of the market she was entering. The man who ended a 20-year marriage because the vine had shown him he needed to be alone to fulfill his mission, and who, 18 months later, was alone and not noticeably closer to a mission, had not been told something false. He had been shown a real part of himself that valued solitude. The vine had amplified that signal to the volume of a calling. What was missing in both cases was proportion. The vine told people things. It did not, as far as anyone could document, tell them how seriously to take those things. That calibration was the work that nobody had told them to do. A senior integration therapist, interviewed in a piece about the psychedelic boom, described it this way: the vine is like a master amplifier. Whatever frequency you're broadcasting at when you arrive, it turns up. If you arrive broadcasting at the frequency of your deepest healing, it amplifies that. If you arrive broadcasting at the frequency of your deepest wound, it amplifies that. If you arrive broadcasting at the frequency of your unexamined belief that you are more important than you have been given credit for, it amplifies that too. The amplifier doesn't know which frequency it's amplifying. That's the human's job, and the humans, arriving without years of dieta, without the icaros, without a tradition to contain what came up, the humans were often not equipped to do that job, not because they were foolish, because nobody had told them it was a job that needed doing. The prophet's essential task, the one that separates genuine prophecy from the amplified version of what you most want to believe, is discernment. The ability to ask, is this real? And am I the right person to transmit it? And is this the right time? The vine provides the experience. Discernment is what you bring. And discernment, it turned out, was not included in the $1,200 retreat package. The critics of the ayahuasca world, and by the late 2000s there were critics, which was itself a sign of how mainstream the conversation had become, fell into roughly two camps. The first camp were the harm reduction people. They were not against the vine. They were against the absence of safeguards. They wanted medical screening, trained facilitators, regulatory frameworks, mandatory reporting of adverse events. They were, in effect, asking for the vine to be treated the way any other powerful medicine was treated, with the infrastructure that matched its risks. Their work was slow and unglamorous, and they were often dismissed by the more spiritually inclined corners of the ayahuasca world as bringing a medical bureaucracy to something that transcended medicine, which was, they noted with some frustration, exactly the attitude that produced the laminated certificates. They published guidelines. They wrote open letters. They tried to build coalitions among retreat centres around basic safety standards. Some centres adopted them. Most did not, because the standards were voluntary, and compliance was optional, and the market did not reward safety documentation over testimonials. The second camp were the voices from within, former facilitators who had stepped back, practitioners who had grown uncomfortable with what they were seeing, integration therapists who had accumulated enough case files to recognize patterns. These voices were quieter than the testimonial culture that dominated online ayahuasca spaces. Testimonials were vivid and easy to share. I went and it was complicated, and I'm still working it out 2 years later, didn't write itself into a 5-star review. But they accumulated. Former facilitators writing essays about why they stopped. Integration therapists describing what they were seeing without violating confidentiality. A few researchers publishing findings that complicated the dominant narrative. The dominant narrative was, the vine transforms. The complicating finding was, it transforms some people, in some circumstances, in some directions. And the circumstances matter more than the ceremony culture was willing to admit. There was a motivation that appeared in the surveys but was almost never discussed openly in the community: status. By the mid-2000s, ayahuasca had become a form of social capital in specific communities: the wellness world, the tech world, certain corners of the creative industries. Having done it, particularly at a well-regarded retreat centre, signalled something. It signalled seriousness about inner work. It signalled access to the retreat, the journey, the experience. It signalled membership in a community of people who took transformation seriously. This was not the primary motivation for most people. For most people, it was genuinely secondary to the therapeutic or spiritual reasons, but it was present, and the industry understood it, and the industry's marketing reflected it. The luxury retreats in particular had understood that their product was not just healing, it was a specific kind of identity. The person who had done Rhythmia in Costa Rica or a premium Shipibo retreat in Peru had a story to tell. The story was about their healing, yes, but it was also about the fact that they were the kind of person who had gone to Rhythmia in Costa Rica. Researchers who study psychedelic use noted this pattern without quite knowing what to do with it. On one hand, social motivation was present in almost every form of human behaviour and didn't invalidate the therapeutic outcomes. On the other hand, when the motivation for seeking a powerful psychedelic experience included the social benefits of being seen to have sought it, that created a particular kind of pressure on the experience itself, the story had to be good, the transformation had to be real, the prophet had to have received something worth transmitting, the vine reliably delivered. Online, the counter-narrative was finding its voice. The same platforms that had built the testimonial culture now hosted its critics. Reddit threads titled Ayahuasca Skeptic accumulated thousands of upvotes. YouTube channels collected experiences that did not resolve into clarity and purpose. A genre emerged, the Integration Crisis account, in which people described what had happened when the ceremony had produced not insight but destabilization, not purpose but prolonged confusion, not a calling but a very expensive several years of trying to make sense of what they had been shown. These accounts shared a structural similarity. The person had gone in with high hopes. The ceremony had been intense. They had returned with certainty about something, their mission, their path, a relationship they needed to leave or a direction they needed to pursue. They had acted on the certainty, and over time the certainty had not held up to contact with reality. The online culture around ayahuasca was built for the testimony of transformation. It had no vocabulary for "I did the thing and it made my life worse." Saying this in an integration circle produced concern and suggestions to do more integration work, possibly with a more experienced guide, possibly with more ceremonies. The solution to a ceremony that hadn't worked was almost always more ceremonies. The counter-narrative communities, by contrast, were genuinely cautious about this loop. They pointed out that the financial incentive to keep people in the cycle was structural, not malicious. The retreat industry benefited from repeat customers, and the calling to facilitate more ceremonies ensured a steady supply of new participants. None of which meant the vine didn't work. It meant the vine worked for some people and not others, and the culture around it had been built to amplify the successes and absorb the failures quietly. The gap between what the culture believed about ayahuasca and what the research actually supported had become, by the early 2020s, large enough to map. The culture believed it's safe because it's natural. The research said it's one of the most intense psychedelic experiences available. It involves vomiting and terror and temporary ego dissolution, and it is contraindicated with a significant number of common medications, heart conditions and psychiatric histories. The culture believed if it's legal in Peru, is probably fine. The research said Peru has no regulatory framework for the commercial retreat industry. Legal means unregulated. The culture believed traditional shamans know what they're doing. The research said some do. Many of the people in the tourist circuit have no lineage training and acquired their role by purchasing the plants and a certificate. The culture believed ayahuasca cures addiction. The research said the evidence is preliminary. The outcomes depend heavily on integration support, and the retreat model that sends people home on Monday is not well designed for the kind of sustained follow-up the evidence actually supports. The culture believed the calling visions are real messages. The research said confirmation bias is documented. The vine tends to tell people what they psychologically most want to hear with particular reliability. None of these corrections made the real therapeutic cases less real, but they pointed at something the ayahuasca world had not fully reckoned with: the distance between what the vine could genuinely offer and what the industry had promised on its behalf. The vine had not made those promises, the industry had. A third force, harder to name as a camp because it was less organised, was something that might be called the grounded integration movement. It emerged from people who had taken the vine seriously, had genuine experiences, and had come to believe that the ceremony itself was being overweighted, that the actual work of transformation happened not in the 5-hour ceremony, but in the months and years afterward, that the vision was the beginning of a process, not the process itself, and that treating it as the process was a way of avoiding the process. The call, go back to the jungle, which was genuinely the next step that many integration therapists found themselves recommending to clients who were struggling with previous experiences, was not the solution they were hoping for. Going back to the jungle produced more visions, more certainty, more mission. The person came back with even stronger instructions and still no framework for implementing them. What was needed was not a better ceremony. What was needed was integration work, the slow, unglamorous, non-visionary process of taking what had been shown and gradually, carefully, making it functional in ordinary life. The grounded integration movement's central message was something no retreat center could charge $1,500 to deliver. The vine gives you material. You're responsible for what you do with it. This was not a viral message. It was not a testimonial. It did not produce a compelling podcast episode. It was, the practitioners believed, the thing that actually worked. The inflation, once named, was easier to trace backward through the case files. The soldier who came back from a ceremony and resigned his commission because he'd been shown he was meant to heal, not fight. The university professor who abandoned a 30-year academic career because the vine had revealed that credentials were a cage. The newly sober addict who, 3 weeks after his first ceremony, announced to his support group that he no longer needed meetings because he had received a deeper healing. All of these people had received something real in the ceremony. The soldier had real grief about the violence in his past. The professor had a real relationship with institutional constraint that deserved examination. The addict had a real, genuinely profound shift in his relationship to the craving. The vine had found those things. It had amplified them. It had delivered them with the force and clarity of certainty. What it had not done was tell them what to do next. That was where the tradition had always been essential. In the Amazonian context, what came up in ceremony was brought back to the healer, who interpreted it in relation to the person's actual circumstances, their relationships, their body, their community, their history. The revelation was not treated as an instruction. It was treated as information. Information to be weighed, considered, and placed carefully within a life. The modern Western ceremony had no equivalent of that conversation. It had an integration therapist, maybe. If the person was lucky and had the resources to pay for one and the self-awareness to seek one out. More often, it had the integration circle, the warm, committed group of people who had all received their own revelations and were not structurally positioned to say, "Have you considered that you might be overinterpreting this?" The question of what the vine was actually for, not culturally, not spiritually, but pharmacologically, was one the researchers had been trying to answer with increasing precision. The compounds in the brew affected serotonin receptors in the brain's default mode network, the network responsible for self-referential thinking, for the mind's habit of narrating itself, for the construction of the felt sense of being a coherent I moving through time. Disrupting this network temporarily produced the ego dissolution that everyone who had done this described, the sense of the self becoming fluid or disappearing entirely. What happened in that window of dissolution, the researchers believed, was a period of heightened neural plasticity, the brain temporarily more open to new patterns, new connections, new ways of organizing its own self-narrative. The change in self-conception that many people reported wasn't mystical. It was neurological. The brain had been briefly loosened from its habitual grooves. The therapeutic opportunity in that loosening was real. Depression, among other things, is characterized by extremely rigid negative self-narrative, the same grooves, worn deep, playing the same story. A compound that temporarily disrupted those grooves gave the brain a window to find different paths. The question was what the brain did with that window. In a therapeutic context with a trained guide and a careful integration protocol, the window was used deliberately. The new paths were built toward health. In an unstructured ceremony with no guide qualified to help and no follow-up, the window was used by whatever was loudest at the time. And the loudest thing in most of the Western seekers who arrived at the ceremony was the hope that they mattered more than the world had told them, none of which made the therapeutic cases less real. People with treatment-resistant depression, who had tried every available medication and every available therapy, and who came out of a ceremony genuinely remitted. These cases were real, and they were important. The vine, or something in the vine, had done something that nothing else had managed. The researchers' careful position was this: the compound works, the setting matters, the integration matters. Given the right conditions, the outcomes can be remarkable. The retreat industry's position was different. The retreat industry had discovered that the certainty produced by the ceremony, regardless of the quality of the setting, produced 5-star reviews. The reviews produced bookings. The bookings funded the next round of ceremonies. The incentive structure rewarded the certainty. It did not reward the careful inquiry into whether the certainty was warranted. That inquiry was the work nobody was paying for. But whether anyone was listening to that message was a different question entirely. And what the vine had done to the culture that had come looking for it, that reckoning was still arriving. What the vine had done over the course of 4 decades of Western engagement, from Burroughs' terrified letters to 5-star retreat reviews to Supreme Court oral arguments, was expose something about the culture that had come looking for it. The culture was hungry. Not for the vine specifically. The vine was almost incidental. Hungry for meaning. Hungry for the feeling of mattering, of having a purpose recognized by something beyond the ordinary social structures that had failed to provide it. Hungry for the experience of being known at a level deeper than the level at which ordinary life usually knew you. The vine was extraordinarily good at delivering that feeling. The question of whether the feeling pointed at something real, whether the people who came back as prophets were genuinely sent, or whether they had accessed a very vivid version of the thing they most wanted to believe about themselves, that question was not one the vine could answer. It wasn't designed to answer it. It was designed by 4,000 years of use in a defined tradition with a defined framework to give the shaman information about a sick person. The shaman asked a question. The vine provided material. The tradition interpreted what the material meant. The tradition had been removed. The question had been changed. The person asking the question was now also the subject of the inquiry. And the vine, presented with this new arrangement, did what it had always done. It amplified whatever was most present. What was most present in the Western seekers who'd been coming to the jungle for 4 decades was the hope that they mattered more than they had been told. This is not a damning observation. It is an honest one. The hunger is real. The absence that produces it is real. The culture that tells people they should have found meaning and purpose through the standard available routes, career, family, faith, consumption, and then delivers those routes in forms that leave millions of people quietly certain that something essential is missing, that culture is real and it produces real suffering. The vine did not invent the wound. It found the wound and worked with it. In the Amazonian tradition, when a healer found a wound in ceremony, the work was not to validate it. The work was to address it, to understand its source, to treat it with whatever was appropriate, to help the person integrate it back into their life and their community. The Western version had no equivalent of that second part. The ceremony found the wound. The ceremony showed it. The ceremony delivered an intense, vivid, thoroughly convincing experience of the wound being healed, or of the wound being meaningful, or of the wound being the exact wound that would make you uniquely suited to some larger task. And then the ceremony ended, and the wound was still there, sometimes smaller, sometimes genuinely healed. More often, the same size, but now carrying the additional weight of having been cosmically endorsed. The most careful voices in the ayahuasca world were beginning to say, by the early 2020s, something that sounded simple, but cut against the entire commercial structure of the industry. The ceremony is not the healing. The ceremony is a door. What is on the other side of the door is not more ceremonies. It is ordinary life. The unglamorous, frustrating, potentially transformable life the person already had before they bought the plane ticket to Iquitos. The vine could not do that work for them. The vine could open the door. The vine could show them what they were carrying. The vine could, in favourable conditions, with good support, with the right psychological raw material, loosen the grip of patterns that had been holding the person in place. But the loosening was not the same thing as the change. The change was what the person built in the months and years that followed in their actual relationships, their actual work, their actual daily life. The retreat industry had sold the door. The door was real. The door was genuinely something. But people kept buying the door and expecting to find themselves already on the other side of it. And the door kept opening, and the other side kept being their life, still there, waiting. The people who had done the most ceremonies were not, by the observations of the integration therapists, necessarily the most transformed. This was a finding that the ayahuasca community resisted because it challenged the basic commercial premise of the industry and the basic experiential logic of the culture. More seemed like it should mean better. More ceremonies, more healing, more visions, more clarity, more dissolution, more transformation. What the integration therapists were seeing in their long-term clients was something different. The people with the most ceremonies often had the most elaborate cosmologies, rich, detailed accounts of what the vine had shown them across years of work. They had a precise vocabulary for their experiences. They had strong relationships with the entities they had encountered and the missions they had been given. They also, frequently, had the most difficulty functioning in the areas of their lives where functioning was most needed. The ceremonies had become, for some of them, the primary mode of processing. The vine was the therapist, the consultant, the relationship advisor, the career counsellor. Every significant decision was brought back to the Maloka. Every difficulty was material for the next ceremony. The vine had not failed them. The vine had given them exactly what they asked for every time. The vine was extraordinarily reliable that way. The problem was what they had been asking for. What the West was asking the vine, in the formulation that the commercial retreat industry had perfected, was, "Tell me who I am and what I should do." This was not the question the vine had been designed to answer. The vine had been designed to give her healer diagnostic information about a sick person. Clear information for a defined purpose, within a framework that told the healer what the information meant and how to act on it. "Tell me who I am and what I should do" is a different kind of question. It is the question of a person who has lost confidence in their own judgment, or who never fully developed it, or who lives in a culture that has systematically undermined it by telling people simultaneously that they are special and that the paths available to them are narrow. The vine, presented with this question, did the only thing it knew how to do. It amplified. It amplified the person's deepest sense of who they were, which was usually someone who mattered more than the world was currently recognizing. And it amplified their deepest sense of what they should do, which was usually something more important, more meaningful, more connected to the larger purpose that they could feel but not quite articulate. The resulting download felt like an answer. It was not an answer. It was the question at full volume. But at full volume, a question can sound like an answer, especially at 3 a.m. in the dark, with your ego dissolved and the jungle performing outside, and the facilitator's songs winding through the ceremony space like something alive. The vine was not lying. The vine was not performing. The vine was simply doing what 4,000 years of Amazonian practice had trained it to do. It found the most charged material in the person who had come to it, and it brought that material forward into the light. In the tradition, what happened next was the shaman's work. The shaman looked at the material and said, "Here is what this means. Here is what you should do with it. Here is the proportion it deserves in your life." In the retreat, what happened next was the person went back to their hotel room and started composing a message to their employer about their resignation. The ayahuasca world had no agreed mechanism for resolving this. The tradition had one. The tradition had the shaman, who was not the same person as the seeker, who held the ceremony from outside the experience and could therefore see it with different eyes. The shaman interpreted, the shaman placed. The shaman told the person what the material meant, drawing on years of training and community knowledge and the accumulated interpretive work of everyone who had come before. The Western retreat model had inverted this. The ceremony guide, in most cases, was also someone who had been through the experience themselves. Their authority came from their own transformation. Their interpretive framework was their own integration work. They were not outside the experience, evaluating it with trained distance. They were inside it, alongside the participant, both of them receiving messages from the same source. This was, for genuine healing work, not ideal. It was the equivalent of going to a doctor who diagnosed you based on their own symptoms. The doctor might have had a genuinely important medical experience. The doctor's condition might even be similar to yours. But the practice of medicine depends on a distinction between the doctor and the patient, on someone being outside the experience, able to evaluate it, able to apply training and accumulated knowledge and professional judgment that doesn't depend on the doctor's own experience of illness. The Vine traditions had developed the shaman for exactly this reason. The West had replaced the shaman with someone who had done a few retreats and felt called to help. The indigenous communities had also found, by this point, different ways of responding to what had happened to their practice. Some had withdrawn. Certain Shipibo healers had stopped working with Western clients entirely, deciding that the economics were not worth what it cost to have their tradition treated as a product. They had watched a practice developed over centuries, carefully transmitted, carefully protected, serving real healing functions within real communities, get extracted from its context, repackaged, and sold at markup to people who would take it home and use it as the foundation for an identity. The retreat industry continued without them. Some had engaged. A few communities had developed formal licensing structures, cultural protocols, educational programs for Westerners that attempted to transmit at least some of the framework their tradition used to contain the experience. These programs were good. They were also drop-bucket interventions against an industry that had long since outgrown any single community's ability to shape it. Some had sued. There were cases in Peruvian courts involving intellectual property claims over indigenous healing practices. The legal theory was novel and its outcomes uncertain. The underlying frustration was not. The Shipibo had given the world something. The world had taken it, commodified it, and was now charging $1,200 a night to access a version of it that bore only surface resemblance to the original. The vine was theirs, the industry was not, none of which changes the closing fact, which is this. And the closing fact is the one the vine has always known. The vine has been in the Amazon for millions of years. It has outlasted the Inquisition and the DEA and the laminated certificate industry. It has survived being called heresy, being called a drug, being called plant medicine, being called a hack, being called sacred. It has survived being turned into a product, being taken out of context, being used by people who had no tradition and no container and no framework for what they were receiving. The vine simply grew. It always simply grew. The psychedelic reform movement that had been building momentum through the late 2000s reached a notable milestone in 2020, when Oregon became the first American state to legalize psilocybin-assisted therapy. The law created a licensed framework, trained facilitators, licensed service centers, regulated dosing. It was cautious, clinical, and very much not what the counterculture had envisioned when McKenna was recording cassette tapes about the archaic revival. There were no icaros. There were session reports and intake forms and follow-up protocols, but it was legal, and it was a template. The advocates who had spent years arguing that psychedelic-assisted therapy belonged in mainstream medicine watched Oregon's law pass and felt something that was somewhere between vindicated and cautious. Vindicated because the argument had prevailed. Cautious because they knew that a regulatory framework was only as good as the humans operating within it, and the history of the vine suggested that the humans were very good at finding ways to sell transformation without providing it. Other states began considering similar measures. The vine's long walk toward some form of legality was continuing, one state ballot at a time, with the specificity and patience that the vine had always managed. The plant had been around for millions of years. It could wait out the regulatory process. Ayahuasca remained Schedule 1 in the United States, Class A in the United Kingdom, controlled in most of the Western world, with narrow exemptions for religious use in a few jurisdictions. But the cultural climate had shifted enough that the question was no longer whether psychedelic-assisted therapy would become normalized. The question was when and in what form and who would control the framework. That last question, who controlled the framework, was one the vine had been asking since the first missionary showed up with a quill and a theological objection. What the vine leaves behind, looked at honestly, is more complicated than either its advocates or its critics want to acknowledge. The therapeutic evidence is real. The Johns Hopkins research, the NYU studies, the smaller-scale ayahuasca-specific work. There is genuine data suggesting that these compounds, in the right conditions, produce lasting reductions in depression and anxiety, measurable shifts in personality toward openness and connection, and sometimes a genuine reorganization of the person's relationship to their own suffering. This is not nothing. This is, in some cases, everything. The problem is that the right conditions is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. The right conditions, in the research that showed benefit, looked like this. A study participant carefully screened for contraindicated conditions, 2 or more preparatory sessions with trained therapists, a monitored ceremony environment, at least 2 follow-up integration sessions. Therapists present throughout, trained specifically in psychedelic-assisted work, able to intervene if anything went wrong. The right conditions took months of design, significant institutional resources, and an ethical review board that would not let the researchers proceed if the safeguards were inadequate. The retreat industry was offering a booking form, a waiver, and 5 days in the jungle with a person whose training you had not independently verified. These were not the same product. The gap between them was enormous and almost never discussed in the culture that had grown up around the vine, because discussing it would require acknowledging that the personal transformations so luminously described in testimonials and podcasts might have been more dependent on luck, on the quality of the individual practitioner, on the chance alignment of the participant's psychology with the ceremony's demands than anyone wanted to admit. The retreat industry sold experience. The research was studying something considerably more careful. The honest accounting, if anyone was willing to do it, would go something like this. The vine works. For some people, in some settings, it works extraordinarily well, producing changes that nothing else had managed, opening doors that had been closed for decades, giving people access to parts of themselves they had spent years building walls around. These cases are real, and they matter. The vine also fails. For some people, in some settings, it amplifies the wrong material, endorses the most grandiose available interpretation of the person's situation, and sends them home with a very expensive certainty that turns out, over the following years, to be the certainty that does the most damage to their actual life. Both things are true. The culture had built itself around the first truth and arranged not to see the second. The vine didn't care about either assessment. The vine simply grew. The vine is still growing in the Amazon. It has been there for millions of years, producing its particular chemistry, playing its role in the ecosystem, entirely indifferent to the cultural conversation happening on the other side of the world about what it means. The Shipibo healers who have been working with it for generations continue to work with it. The ceremonies continue. The icaros are still being sung. In the communities that developed this practice, it is still being used the way it was always used. Carefully, with purpose, within a tradition that knows what it is and what to do with what it gives you. The shamans still go in with questions. They still come back with information. They still help their communities with what the vine provides. They have been doing this for somewhere between 1,000 and 4,000 years, depending on which archaeologist you ask. They are not doing it to find their purpose. They already have a purpose. The purpose is, use the vine carefully within the tradition to help the people who need it. That is it. That is the entire instruction set. On the other side of that, there are thousands of retreat centers and urban facilitators and integration coaches and online communities and celebrities and entrepreneurs and people in profound need of something, all orbiting the same vine, all certain, in some proportion, that what it showed them was true. They are not necessarily wrong about that. The vine did show them something. The something was real. What the vine showed, when you trace it across the full arc, from the pre-contact Amazon to the Inquisition files, to Burroughs' terrified letters to McKenna's cassette tapes, to the laminated certificates to the Supreme Court ruling to the integration therapist's office, is not what most people who drink it would expect it to have shown. It showed the culture back to itself. It took each person who came to it and ran their most charged material through one of the most powerful amplifiers the human nervous system can experience. And what came out the other side was not the vine's message. It was the person's message, at full volume, with the narrating mind's capacity for doubt temporarily offline. The 4,000-year tradition had a container for that. The shaman interpreted the experience, placed it within a framework, and helped the practitioner understand what to actually do with it. The shaman was the calibration the vine itself could not provide. The modern Western seeker had no shaman in that sense. They had a guide who had done a weekend course, and an integration therapist who would try to help them afterward, and a community of people who had all received the same class of message and were very unlikely to say, "But how much of that was you?" The question that remains, and it is the question the vine itself cannot answer, because the vine is a plant, and plants do not do epistemology, is this: how much of what it showed them was the vine speaking, and how much was the most wanted, most urgent, most unchosen part of themselves speaking back? In 4,000 years of use, within a tradition that knew how to ask that question, the answer was navigable. In $1,200 retreats with laminated certificates on the wall, it is considerably less so. The vine keeps growing, the seekers keep coming, the prophets keep returning, each one carrying a revelation, each one certain that what they received was real, each one unable to keep it to themselves. And if you ask the vine whether the sending is warranted, the vine will not answer. It is a plant. What it has been, consistently, across the full sweep of everything that has happened to it, before the missionaries and after them, before the beats and after them, before the retreat industry and in the middle of it, is present, available, willing. The vine has never turned anyone away. Whatever the source of what it gives them, the message that comes back is always the same. You matter. You have something to do. You are, in whatever form this particular moment requires it, sent. The vine has been making profits for 4,000 years. It has yet to be wrong about a single one who believed the sending.